I'm really honored to be here, really, and yeah, so I'm really happy to talk about the topic on Chinese binding theory and the binding of Chinese reflexives, and yeah, so perhaps to start with, I would like to just start my talk with just a very brief history on the research on Chinese reflexives. I would say the Chinese reflexive is still one of the most widely researched topics in Chinese linguistics, and it is still very productive even up to the present day. Um, so usually we attribute the first detailed study of the Chinese reflexives to Y.H. Wang, 1984. And he identified a number of really important properties, and one of which is for the long distance binding of simplex reflexives Ji. All right, and we'll talk a lot about this reflexive today. And so why is it interesting? Usually, well, long-distance reflexives are considered something quite fascinating, especially for theoretical linguists, because of their what called apparent exemption from the classical binding principle A. So apparent exemption, I use the word apparent because it also depends on how your analysis is and some of the analysis of a long-distance binding to try to conform to binding condition A. But anyway, so what they look like on the surface is that, okay, they do not obey this principle, all right? And that's why long-distance reflexives are sometimes also called exempt reflexives, all right, because they seem to be exempted from condition A. And since Y.H. Wang in 1984, then there are lots of different theoretical proposals being put forth from all different kinds of perspectives. Although I'll mention the findings of some of these studies today, I won't be able to go into the technical details of their proposal, but I'll just briefly point out just a few here to just highlight the fact that there can be many different ways of approaching long-distance binding in Chinese. All right, so usually when we ask Chinese linguists, we do research on Chinese reflexives. So which one is the earliest paper? So I think Tang, 1989, would always come to our mind because it's a very classical work in the government and binding framework. At that time, they use the movement-based approach in the LF. Okay, that's something that I will talk a little bit more later today. All right, and also 10 identified a property called subcommand relation, which turns out to be quite special in Chinese in comparison to other languages. All right, and at the same time, there are later some theoretical linguists propose that so long-distance binding is not it's not anaphoric in the sense that it should be something called logophoric binding. And this is a thing that is quite important to my proposal as well. All right, and I'll talk about logophoric binding. So, and you can see that logophoric binding, started, well, actually it might be a bit earlier than 2001, and then and still up to this day, we're still talking about, for example, Charnefol, they're still talking about logophoric binding as a type of binding for long, as the real identity of a long distance binding. Right. At the same time, there are some recent minimalist approaches. For example, Giblin's approach and Rulin's, they also work on some Chinese data. And and then on the other hand, there are people approaching it from a purely pragmatic perspective, like Wai Huang or Sperlich. Okay, they're more pragmatic in the sense, yeah. Okay, so just a very brief history of or very brief introduction of different perspectives that we can use to approach the same problem. So for today's talk, all right, so I will focus on just two reflexives. One is called Ta Ji. So this is what we call complex reflexives, all right, because it can be broken down into two morphemes. Ta means something like he or she, and then Ji means self. All right, so we call it complex reflexives. And the other one is simplex reflexives, Ji. Okay, so I'll talk a lot about, I'll focus on these two. So in the first part of my talk, okay, I'll discuss the empirical data and all the distributional properties. And in the second part, okay, I will talk about long-distance binding and how it related to something called logophoricity. But my focus today is mainly on part 1 and part 2, especially part 1, I would say, because no matter what theoretical framework we choose, at the end, we still need to explain all these empirical facts. All right, so something that I will talk about. Okay, and as well as and part 3, I'll talk a bit more about how to model it from a lexical functional grammar perspective. But as I was preparing for this talk, I was aware that many of my audience are not familiar with the LFG framework. So instead of focusing on the technicalities, I just want to give it more like an overall impression of how one might approach the problem from an LFG perspective. So I won't be giving a full analysis here. So I just focus on a part of it, and I will try to describe my steps of analysis in a relatively intuitive manner. All right, yeah. So that is my plan. Yeah. All right. So let's come to the let's start with the empirical data and the distributional properties. The first one is the first property is local versus long distance binding. All right. So the complex reflexives target Z, what we found is that it has to be bound by what we call the closest potential antecedent. Okay, so I just use the term closest here as a more intuitive way. Okay, so later we'll talk about how this concept closest can be defined. Okay, in a given formal framework. All right, so let's take a look at data. Example 1, for example, Zhang San says that Li Xu always praises himself. All right, so what happened here is that there are two potential antecedents, Zhang San and Li Xu. Okay, and the complex reflexives is always being bound by the one closer to it, Li Xu. All right, so and in this sentence, complex reflexive is the object. All right, so assume the object function. Okay, and in the second example here, Zhang San says Li Xu always, and then in complex self, okay, complex reflexive, no confidence, okay, with no confidence in himself. So in who? In Zhang San or Li Xu. So we should closer one, Li Xu, okay. And in this sense, okay, it assumes we'll call a more oblique argument, yeah. And then, so different from English, all right, so I think, for example, example 3 is a bit different from English. So in Chinese, we can say that Zhang San says, okay, Li Xu thinks himself, okay, very diligent. Okay, so we can use a complex reflexive as in the as an embedded subject. All right, and in this sense, okay, you refer to, okay, again, so we have got two potential antecedents here, and you will co-refer with the closer one. All right, yeah. And similarly, there's also, I think, example 4 is also different from how English reflexives behave. Okay, we can say that Zhang San says Li Xu thinks himself friend. Okay, so that is not something that we say in English, right? Very diligent. Okay, so again, it's being bound by the closer potential antecedent. Okay, so it can be used, reflexive can be used as a what we call possessor function as well, and it assumes and it also engages in local binding. Yeah. But so usually, okay, most Chinese linguists would agree that the complex reflexive targeting conforms to local binding. But at the same time, we also noticed some data that seem to suggest that local binding, is elusive to local binding requirement. Okay, so what are the data here? For example, in example 5, John says that the book has harmed him. Okay, so instead of him, we use himself. Okay, John said that book harmed himself. Okay, so so self here. So oh, by the way, just to mention that this complex reflexive doesn't I mean it does not show the distinction in gender and itself. Okay, so the form doesn't really show this distinction in gender. So even though I use himself here, it doesn't mean that it can't work on herself. We also work on herself as well. All right. So an example for what does it actually mean? Does it mean the book harms itself? No. Okay, it means the book harms John. All right. But it just seems that, okay, if we just look at this data, it just seems that this is a kind of long distance binding. Okay. And similarly, for example 6, okay, Johnson says that book could add complex self, okay, home. That means his home, but we also use a complex reflexives. So it doesn't mean the book's home. It means Johnson's home. All right, but it seems that is it a type of long distance binding? Are people wondering? Okay. Yeah, so similarly, for examples, for the example 7 as well. So that is the kind of debates that some people like Penn, okay, they argue that okay, Tajizi can also have long distance binding, but we'll see that later in my model there, in my theoretical model there, I don't consider it as a type of long distance binding. Okay, it has something to do with the animacy requirement that I will mention very soon. All right. Yep. And then the simplex reflexive targets, simplex reflexive GT, as what I said, okay, it can engage in long distance binding, but at the same time, it is also possible for local binding. And so which one does it go for? It really depends on the context. So in example 8, all right, Zhang San says, Li Xu always praises self. So we've got 2 potential antecedents, and it can refer to one of them. So it depends on the context. Right? So you can contrast it with, it's a nice contrast with example 1 here. Okay, so same sentence or similar sentence, different pronouns, different reflexives. Okay, and one engages in local binding only, but then the other one, okay, for the other one for the simplex reflexives, both local and non-distant binding, they're both possible. Right? So similarly, okay, we use it as an oblique argument here. It's also possible whether you get to say long distance binding or local binding. Okay, both choices are possible. All right, and at the same time, Jizi and Tajizi, both of them can be used as the subject of an embedded clause. Okay, so say himself very diligent. Okay, self very diligent, or self's friend very diligent. Okay, so we as a possessive pronoun as a kind of possessor, call it as a possessor. That's also fine. Okay, yeah. All right. So let's move on to the second property here. So usually, okay, most literature will agree that a complex reflexive targetcy and the simplex reflexives, they are subject-oriented. That means, okay, they need to be bound by a syntactic subject. All right. So in example 12 here, so it is we call it double object construction. So usually how do we know, okay, it is bound by a syntactic subject? We need a sentence, okay, that has both a syntactic subject and then also an entity with maybe an object, all right, a position, and then see which one binds it. And one of the perfect contests we can use to detect this kind of property would be double object construction. So Zhang gives something, okay, Li Xu, okay, self, or so you can either self or complex self, okay, either one of them, okay, picture. All right, so what it means, so here it can only be bound by the syntactic subject, okay, but not the object or oblique object if there is a 2 here. Yeah, okay. Similarly, we can use a tail sentence. It's also a type of a double object construction. Right, so we see they can only be bound by the matrix subject. Okay, yeah. And we can also use a construction of an oblique argument to test for the subject condition here. And what we see here is that, okay, in example 14, Zhang San heard from Li Xu that Wang Wu did not like self. All right, so there are two subjects. One is a matrix subject, and then the other one is an embedded subject. As at the same time, there is an oblique argument from somebody places from somebody. Okay, so we know that. So we can see that okay, this GC okay can be bound by either of these subjects, all right, but not by the oblique argument. Okay, yeah. Nevertheless, okay, there's still, although most Chinese linguists agree that the reflexives they subject to subject requirement. At the same time, okay, we in the literature there's some debate saying that okay, there are some construction types, and it seems that in those construction types, okay, the subject requirement is can be violated. Okay, and one of the construction types, a passive construction type, it seems that okay, it can be bound by an oblique argument. Okay, if we use the same type of analysis that we use for English, in which we analyze the agent by somebody, by him as a type of oblique argument here. So it just seems that then in this case, then I would say that okay, is it really being bound by an oblique argument? If so, okay, then it seems like does not obey subject requirement. And then another one construction that is a bit that's all debatable is about what we call a pre-verbal object or a patient fronting construction. So it's in this construction bar, okay, so we'll call a patient fronting device. Okay, so so it also seems that if we analyze this part, okay, as an oblique argument, then it just seems that okay, it can also be bound by an oblique argument, okay, not just by a subject. All right, so these two are more contentious construction types. Okay, so if I have time, okay, at the end of my talk, we can talk about how we might tackle this kind of what we call the seemingly exceptions. Okay, in LFG, all right, but if we have time to talk about that. But at the moment, let's just assume that okay, subject requirement works. Okay, despite the challenges from from some past studies. Okay, yeah. And then another important property is which is seem to be quite different in comparison with if we look at cross-linguistic studies on with anaphor and antecedent relationships. So most of the time, okay, anaphor antecedent relationship, they will obey a C command if relationship if we adopt a more Chomskyan or configurational approach to deal with binding relationships. All right, but then Chinese is actually quite well known since 1989 that it doesn't really obey C command. It can obey, I mean, the C command relationship can be a bit, or the command relationship, it can be a bit looser to the extent of what we call subcommand. All right, and this is the formal definition of what subcommand is. So instead of going over the formal definition here, we'll take a look at some concrete examples of what subcommand actually is. Okay, so these are the data from 1989. All right, so example 18, Johnson's arrogance has harmed himself. So we see that what actually C command himself or complex self or self is the subject matrix subject, but the antecedent is further embedded in the C commanding entity. Okay, so the antecedent being further embedded in the C commanding entity, okay, is what can considered as subcommand. All right. Similarly, this is a subject clause. All right. So the antecedent is further embedded within the subject clause, or rather than the subject clause itself. Okay, that C commands the reflexive. Okay, and we call this relationship subcommand. And I don't think English works this way, right? We can't say that as so what, for example, in 18, so if I want to express this kind of meaning, I believe I would say has harmed him, okay, rather than himself. All right, but in Chinese, I mean, it does work in this way, right? Yeah. So just further more examples of what subcommands means. Subcommands means, okay, so means that the antecedent is further embedded in a C commanding entity. Okay, in an entity that C commands the another. All right, so further embedded in it. Okay, yeah. And we will look at these examples later. Okay, when I talk about the one of the possible ways to model them in LFG. Right. Yeah. Okay. Then let's move on to the fourth property, which is the we call the animacy debate. I call it debate because it's quite debatable even up to this day. Okay, and so let's take a look at some data first, and I will try to sort them out to understand what exactly is happening there. Okay, so the debate is whether or not the antecedent of GC and tar GC, do they have to be animate? Okay, this is a very debatable issue. And so some people, some studies believe that yes, they have to be animate. But others, for example, I believe some of you might have read Chit-Fung Lam 1981. Okay, they believe that okay, no, they don't have to be animate. Okay, so we will take a look at what's actually happening. All right, and just by discussing the empirical data and see after sorting out the empirical data, okay, what we can find, okay, without subscribing to a theoretical framework, but just inspect the empirical data. All right. So the first one, fire extinguishes itself. So extinguishes self. Okay, so as my own judgment or the tense judgment, okay, this kind of sentence sounds rather bad. All right. Similarly, if we say door closes self, no, this is not really right. Okay, I mean, at least in Chinese, okay, we can't really say that. So in that sense, okay, so it just seems that if we just look at example 22 and 23, so we don't really use self, okay, or complex self, okay, to refer to an inanimate object. Sorry, to refer to an inanimate entity, okay, when especially when the reflexive is an object in the sentence. All right, so we notice that in these two sentences, okay, they occupy the object position. Okay, yeah. But at the same time, we do notice that there are some exceptions as well to this kind of generalization that they must be animate. For example, Tan's quote cited the sentence, "The moon covered herself with dark clouds." So it is actually a kind of more literary usage. Okay, so for people who are interested in literary linguistics, I believe they would classify this as a kind of personification. Right? And then another sentence that is quoted by Huang and Jonathan Huang is that candle burn themselves and lighten others. So all of these kind of so as a native speaker, I would say that well, they sound well, that only works in a particular genres or particular context, like maybe in the literature, okay, or in the more literary style. So we usually consider them as a type of literary device, okay, that is being used to further polish the language. And in that sense, then yes, okay, we can use 句子 or 他句子, okay, to refer to an animate entity. But then if we don't really use, okay, if we are not using that kind of style, then most of the time, so it just seems that, okay, if we just look at the data, 23 to 20, 22, 23, just seems that, okay, well, it doesn't work so much on inanimate entities. Okay, it just seems that it needs to be bound by animate entity. Okay, rather than something inanimate like door. No, and moon, okay, is inanimate, but then it seems to be that it's more of a personification style. Candle is inanimate, but also if you ask native speaker about this sentence, will tell you that okay, yeah, it works in literary style, but just so we don't really use this kind of a sentence quite a lot in our daily conversation. Yeah, if we just don't want to polish our language. Yeah. But at the same time, we have noticed that when the reflexive is used as a possessor, all right, so it seems that in that kind of situation, we can really refer to an inanimate entity. So an example given here is every bookmark that Zhang's made has its unique shape. All right, so it's, we use the complex reflexives to mean is, okay? And whose unique shape is it? Is it Zhang's unique shape or the bookmark's unique shape? It's a bookmark, all right, not the person's shape, all right? So, and similarly, so the sentence from Pan, so the arc bridge casts its shadow on the water surface. Its shadow, so we use the reflexive here. So we know that it's talking about a bridge, and the bridge is inanimate. All right. And then in example 28, okay, this is a sentence from Jennifer Wen Huang, and this biological system can support its own, okay, energy supply. Again, this is the system itself is inanimate, right? Okay, so it seems that if we sort out the data, okay, now we can see some of the we can see why past studies keep on debating about this issue, okay, because when the reflexive is used as a possessor function, okay, it's true that we can refer to an inanimate entity without using any personification, any kind of device like that. All right. Yeah. So why is it like this? Why is the distribution like this? So I try to explain it, okay, and see if yeah, that's how I'll explain it. So first of all, I would say that, okay, when it is a non-possessive function, for example, when it's an object, then I assume that it has to be bound by an animate antecedent, okay, with the exception of personification. So my point of view here is different from Jonathan Wang, okay. But when it is used as an object self-construction, so why? Okay, why is it like this? Because for example, when it's used as an object self-construction, so we are denoting what we call an agent-patient relationship. At the same time, there is a shared identity between the agent and patient. So we are saying that somebody is doing something to himself or herself. Okay, so there is a shared identity between the agent and patient, and it's quite well known that the notion of what we call agenthood, which correlates with the concept of volition. So for prototypical agent, usually is being characterized as something with a high volition, and what can have high level volition is only animate entity, not inanimate entity, right? Yeah. So in that sense, and what we call a shared identity being enforced by the object Zhuzi construction would then entail that the patient is also animate, because we are trying to denote the meaning of somebody doing something to himself or herself. Okay, so it is a kind of meaning. So it's a kind of syntax and semantics correlate. Okay, there. However, when the reflexive is being used as a possessive function, for example, the one that we look at just now, okay, for example, the bridge's shadow, okay, the shape of a bookmark, all right, the shape of a bookmark. So this kind of this is a possessor, okay, when it's used as a possessive function. So so I think some of you might have heard of the typology of a nominal possession before. So it's quite a well-researched area in linguistic typology. Okay, so we say that so possessive function. So possessive function, there can be many different types of possessive function. So for example, cross-linguistically, okay, for example, we can denote ownership, it can denote body parts, denote kinship relation or partial relation. So among these possessive functions, when it comes to the partial relation, for example, bookmark shape, okay, the bridge's shadow, okay, this is a kind of partial relation. So when you're denoting this kind of partial relation, it can be bound by inanimate entity, because even inanimate entities can express, okay, a partial relation. It can be like, for example, a part of a chair, it can be a part of a table, okay, it doesn't have to be animate. All right, so that's how I see it, okay. But then if of course, if the possession, okay, is about ownership, about body part or kinship, okay, so these kind of relations, then of course even the possession, the possessor would have to be animate, right? So this is how I see it, okay, in the context of the typology of a nominal possession. Yeah. All right, and that's how we bring into the modeling as well. Yeah, to my IFG modeling as well. Yeah. And then the next one is the next property here is actually quite well documented, and at the same time it's quite interesting, is that so different from the long distance binding that we see in some other languages. What we have noticed is that in Chinese long distance binding there are something what we call blocking effects. Okay, something quite interesting. So what is that? Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. So what we've found, I mean, there's a range of blocking effects that have been arranged in, that have been identified in the literature. The first one is that the long distance binding by third person noun phrase is blocked by first or second person local noun phrase. Okay, so how does it work? For example, here, okay, in example 29, Zhang San feel I or you, okay, no confidence in self. All right, so if what we would expect is that, okay, this self should be able to be bound by these two subjects, by the matrix subject as or the embedded subject. Okay, so this is true when, okay, I or you is replaced by a third person entity. Okay, but then when it's replaced, when it is a first or second person entity, I or you, that's always sudden the binding relationship with Zhang San is lost. Okay, all of a sudden it's lost. So what's happening? Okay, so this fascinated linguists quite a lot since the 80s, since 10. Okay, we identified this kind of also seems Y.H. Huang identified this kind of blocking. Okay, and I will come to that later. Okay, but just bear in mind at the moment first. Let's just think about it. Okay, why does it happen this way? Right. So if we look at cross-linguistically, if we study long-distance binding other languages like Icelandic or other languages, usually we don't really see this kind of blocking effect. So it just seems that Chinese is rather unique in that sense. Okay, and we will explain it. I'll explain it. Try to give some explanation of why, okay, this kind of thing happens. Okay, and what past proposals have proposed about the blocking effect. Okay, so this is one of the blocking effects here. And the second one, not the second one, but a related one, is that what we realize is even, well, you may say that, you may guess, I guess some of you may think that, is it because, so does this blocking effect only happens when the I and you are in a subject position? Okay, not really. Even non-subject can cause a blocking. All right, so in this sentence, it's a not double object, this is, yeah, so Johnson tell me something. All right, so me is the matrix object. All right, and in that sense, even if it is an object, so we see that it actually block the long distance binding of Johnson. Okay, so it's blocked here because usually, I mean, so we can compare it with the sentence where me is replaced by for example, Mary. Okay, Johnson tells Mary, Li Xu, his self. Okay, and then if that is the situation, then self can co-refer with both Johnson and Mary here. But then if it's replaced by first person or second person pronoun, then all of a sudden, so it blocks the reading of long distance binder. Again, what is happening? Okay, let's think about that first. Okay, what's happening? All right, I will tell you what the literature says on this later very soon. All right. More interestingly is that so although what we call local first or second person noun phrase blocks the long distance binding of a third person noun phrase, just like what we have witnessed in example 30. All right, but then a local third-person noun phrase does not block the long-distance binding of a first or second-person noun phrase. Okay, and we call this a personal asymmetry or blocking effects. So let's compare. Let's compare with example 31. I feel. Zhang will hate self. Okay, this self can refer with both I and Zhang. Fine. Okay, the co-reference is fine. We can contrast it with let me see the better contrast. Yeah, we can contrast it with this one. Okay, example 29 that I just mentioned. Okay, first, second person pronoun blocks the long distance binding of a third person entity. All right, but then a third person entity does not block the long distance binding of a first person or second person entity. So again, what is happening? I mean, it's something, well, it's also sort of very, we find it quite fascinating. Like, why would there be such a personal asymmetry there? What is going on with long distance binding in Chinese? Why are there so many complexities of this sort that we would not expect if we look at cross-linguistically, if we look at other languages that allow long distance binding? Okay, they don't seem to happen. Okay. All right, and then another blocking effect as pointed out by Huang and Liu is that we'll call it dialectical use of a third person noun phrase will result in blocking. So what does it mean? So in the sentence, so without a dialectical use, say Zhang San says so he deceives self. Okay, without the dialectical use, so we will expect that Zhang San and he, they should all be the potential binders of self. All right, but then dialectical use means, for example, finger pointing. Okay, let's just say that Zhang San says, when the person who is saying this sentence, when they say he, okay, then they point to someone in the audience, for instance, point to someone in the conversation, like it's not Zhang San, okay, and then in that sense, okay, so the long distance binder, okay, Zhang San, okay, is blocked. So we call so it's a type of and Liu and Huang also consider it as a kind of blocking effect, but I would say that it might not be on the same sort as the personal symmetry that we just saw here. But anyway, this is what the literature has been claiming. And then another one is if I think this is, yeah, the last blocking effect I'll introduce here is quite a complicated one. So what happened is that, so when there is more than one instance of jizi in the sentence, then the long distance potential antecedent of jizi results in a blocking to another potential long distance antecedent further away. What do I mean? Okay, so example 33. John thinks Bill knows Mark lends sales book to sales friends. So this sentence given by Penn 2001. So there are a number of possible readings of what Zizi can refer to, and among these possibilities that are listed here, two of them are actually not attested. So the first one is, so when this Zizi, first one, refer with John, okay, so this is a long distance binding relationship, right? And then the second Zizi refers to Bill. This is also a long distance binding relation, okay, because in this sense, yeah, Mark is the closest and potential antecedent, okay? So in that sense, okay, then this can't happen. It seems that, okay, one long distance binding relationship with blocks the other long distance binding relationship, okay? So similarly for I, okay, so again, okay, so we have first one, so it refers with Jitsi. First Jitsi refer with Bill, again it's long distance binding, and then second Jitsi refer with John, okay, it says long distance binding. So this kind of relationship doesn't work either. All right. So again, what's happening? Okay, I will explain a bit more very soon. Okay, and on the other hand, So for local binding, so you may think that, okay, it happens for long distance binding. I mean, we've been talking about a blocking effect of long distance binding, but does it happen for local binding as well? This kind of blocking effects? The answer is no. Okay, so in example 34, Johnson tell I, okay, cell or complex cell secret. Okay, and in that sense, so we see that this one, the as well just said, okay, the complex reflexives or the reflexive is subject oriented, so it has to be bound by the subject of the sentence, and this is just a local binding because I is an object and it's never been a possible potential antecedent at all. Okay, so it's just a local binding, and if, okay, let's say if blocking effects did happen, what we would expect is that we can't use a reflexive here because it would be blocked reading, right? Okay, we have to use, for example, just a personal pronoun like his. In Chinese, we can use another personal pronoun, but not reflexive if blocking effects did happen. But the fact is, okay, blocking effects don't happen, all right, and that's why we can still co-refer with the subject as normal. All right, so what we see is that there is a contrast between long distance and locally bind reflexives, okay, in terms of the availability of blocking effects. And we will take it as a type of evidence to say that, okay, long distance binding and local binding in Chinese, they involve different binding mechanisms. All right. So that's something I will talk about again, okay, very soon. Okay. Yeah. I'll return to this point very soon. Yeah. All right. So now, okay, I'll talk about, okay, how then pass this account, given there's so many complexities, especially in terms of the blocking effects and things. So how do pass this account for the long distance binding of GZ? Okay, we focus on GZ here first because GZ involves long distance binding and is something that we have been that has been quite fascinating. Okay, so pass is they usually divide into two different strands. All right, so the first strand is what called a feature agreement proposals. And it's quite popular, especially with linguists who maybe have more Chomskyan type of approach, and we want to look at, if we place more emphasis in the syntax here, okay, and then this kind of proposal is something that syntacticians would like to go for. All right, so in the 80s, so there were quite a lot of what we call the movement-based feature agreement proposals that are being used. And these proposals, they always do something called LF movement, the LF, okay? So, and long distance binding in these proposals are considered as some successive steps of local binding. So each of these steps will satisfy principle A, okay, each of the steps. So, and in the movement, it's like the entity moves in the LF, okay, to the I position of smaller IP and then move up and up, okay? So I'll give an example here. So this is an example given by me, and I want to use this example, just try to capture, okay, the essence of what the LF head movement proposal is in the 80s, or just the essence of it, although, different proposals, so different technical details as well. Anyway, so example 35, okay, Li Sui believes Zhang San his self. Okay, so the self can refer to Li Sui or can refer to Zhang San. Okay, so the LF structure, okay, that gives rise to the long distance binding. I'm talking about the I reading. Okay, the long distance binding is like this. Okay, so first of all, juicy originates from here, then it moves up. Okay, then it moves up again. All right, so in each of these movements, so Juicy had to agree with the specifier in 5 features. So it has to agree with the person, number, etc. Okay, so here, okay, Juicy need to agree with Zhang San, and then as it move up, Juicy need to agree with Li Su. Okay, so this is constrained by a very famous constraint called the head movement constraint. All right, so and we see that in each step of the movement, Juzi and its trace, okay, need to agree with the specifier of the IP, and therefore the specifiers themselves, okay, like Zhang and Juzi, they have to agree in person and number on those 5 features as well. Okay, so that is so in that sense, okay, then blocking effect we explained by, for example, if we look at the blocking effect of just a very the early one. So this one. So how would those proposals explain the blocking effect here? Is they will explain it because there was some these two, okay, they don't agree in 5 features. Okay, this is a first person, this is a third person entity, okay, and the movement, okay, they don't agree. Okay, GC, you know, they, I mean, yeah, because GC needs to agree with this one at the same time it has, and after being moved to this part, okay, GC is already a first, is already has already become like a first person entity. That's why it cannot agree further with the third person entity. So there was some clash in the agreement mechanism. So that's how a movement approach would explain it. And in the 80s, but then I've noticed that if I in recent years, okay, minimalist studies, some minimalist studies which place strong emphasis on agree as a main mechanism of binding relations. For example, like Woolen's proposal, you know, those proposals, then they would also then they have seemed to regain interest, okay, in this kind of agreement-based proposals, even in recent years. For example, one of the case in point is one of the examples point in case is the Giblin's agree-based account of long-distance Jitsi. Okay, so and how feature checking through the mechanism of continuous agree, okay, can make sure that there is some consistency in the 5 feature, and that's why, okay, there's some mismatch. When there is a mismatch of person values, then blocking effect happens. Okay, so this is a still quite a recent proposal, and then and I've noticed that Rulin, I think it's Rulin and colleagues, maybe 2020, yeah, they also adopts this kind of similar type of explanation for blocking effects. However, I would say that, okay, so this kind of feature agreement proposals, the biggest problem is the empirical problems that I have to face, especially when there is such a wide range of blocking effects that we have just seen. And a number of them are actually not quite related to a feature agreement. And some of the effects like person asymmetry. So for example, what we have just talked about, okay, the asymmetry that, you know, like this one, okay, why? So if that is really, you know, if we can just attribute everything to feature agreement, then why, okay, would example 31 be allowed? Because this is what we see here is that, so for the 2 entities, one is what? One is a first person, then the other one is a third person. We expect it to be blocked, right? But it doesn't. So it's a kind of problem that, you know, if we use a feature agreement proposal, we need to use some extra mechanisms to tackle that. And at the same time, we have also talked about identical blocking as well as blocking by another long distance entity, long distance antecedent, like the one that the very complicated one that we just look at, when all the instances here, they are all third person. So there's nothing about, you know, person or mismatching person features at all. Then why would blocking if it happens? Yeah, so this is kind of an empirical problem that if we adopt a feature agreement proposal, then there must be some other formulations that have to be included, extra formulation that have to be included in order to account for these exceptional data. Yeah. Okay. But on the other hand, what we have noticed is that there exists, okay, another kind of approach to this, which is the logophoric proposals, in which long-distance reflexives are analyzed as logophore. All right, and I would say that if we compare with the syntactic feature grouping proposals, so this kind of logophoric proposals are more successful in explaining the wide range of data. Okay, involved in long-distance binding. All right. So, and we do see that, okay, if up to this day, okay, people like Shanafol, they will still stick to this kind of local for proposal rather than Woodland's approach of like I think agree, okay, as the main mechanism of binding, even though both even the both of them they are also considered as minimalist. I would consider them as minimalist. Yeah. So what exactly is a logopher? Yeah. So here I'm quoting a very famous quote when it comes to if we read studies on any studies on logopher, so we usually see this quote. So what is a logopher? So logopher is to designate the individual whose speech, thoughts, feelings, or general state of consciousness are reported or reflect in the linguistic context in which the pronoun occurs. Okay, it's a very famous quote. I've been quoted many, many times in the literature. So it means that, okay, jizzy is used to refer to somebody whose speech or thoughts or feelings we're talking about. Okay, and this somebody or this antecedent, sometimes we call them the virtual speaker or the speaker. Okay, the thinker, the sayer, or the feeler, the one who has a feeling. Okay, and so in that sense, so it is more than, or I would say that's not quite the same as an anapher, because logopher itself, okay, is more of a pragmatic type of concept. Okay, so if we adopt, okay, if we adopt this kind of explanation by analyzing long distance bound jitsi as a logopher, then a blocking effect usually they explain it by perspective conflicts in communication, because it's more of a functional type of explanation. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. Okay, this example again. So we see the blocking effect by I or you. Okay, so why does it happen? So this so a logo for proposal explain it by the fact that, okay, so the blocking effect of a first or second person pronoun is induced because the first or second person pronoun anchors the perspective of a sentence to an external speaker or addressee, which means, okay, in this sentence, when you say I or you, okay, the person who is speaking this sentence is really referring to either himself, okay, the external speaker, okay, or the addressee, okay, the person who is listening to this sentence. Right? However, Zizi as a logopher, as what we just said, okay, logopher so it's used to convey the perspective of an internal speaker, the perspective of Zhang San as a virtual speaker, as a feeler. Zhang San feels yourself. All right. So in that sense, and that we will see that there is a kind of perspective conflict between what we're trying to talk about. So because here, okay, this point, okay, Zhang San feels I or you, so you have to change the perspective to external speaker perspective or addressee perspective. But then when you need to go back, okay, to an internal speaker perspective, then there will be a conflict of perspective. And this kind of conflict causes long-distance binding. All right, so perspective conflict. So this is a kind of functional explanation. And similarly, we can also take a look at this one. So why? Okay, then why does the perspective conflict doesn't happen in this example? Okay, giving rise to the personal symmetry. So what we see is that, so when the matrix subject is a first or second person pronoun, all right, like I, and then feel, Zhang San will hate self. Okay, that's what we see. Okay, so this self can refer with I or Zhang San. Okay, so why does it like this? Because, okay, when the matrix subject is a first or second person pronoun, so it already anchors the perspective to an external speaker. Okay, and Jitsi, okay, if that is a long distance binding, when Jitsi is used as a logopher, it also it also refers to I. That means it also refers to an external speaker. Okay, so there is no conflict in that sense. All right, because we're talking about Jitsi only when Jitsi is used as a long distance binder, okay, is used as, is interpreted as a logopher, and as a logopher, okay, the speaker here, okay, that is tries to co-refer with, okay, is also the external speaker, okay, that the pronoun anchors on. All right, so there's no perspective conflict. Okay, yeah. So similarly, the people would use this kind of perspective anchoring mechanism to explain why the dialectical use of a pronoun will cause the blocking effects. And even if it comes to the most complicated example where there are multiple long distance binder, okay, and then and why they're blocking effects, okay, so we say that because the different logophoricity, okay, the anchors the utterance to varying perspectives, okay, so the different perspectives of people. All right, that's why causing the problems. Okay, yep. So this is so the logo for proposal. So once again, I mean, I think it was made most well known by Huang and Liu's approach, Huang Liu's proposal, and it's still very influential to these days. Okay, like Jean Lefort, they still stick to this kind of interpretation of long distance binding as type of local void binding, and then use the perspective or conflict as a type of explanation for the blocking effects. All right, it's still quite prevalent up to this day. We have seen that, okay, this kind of logo for proposal, it does seem to explain a wider set of I mean, it does seem to explain a wider and such an empirical data in terms of the blocking effects in comparison with the feature grouping proposal, especially the movement-based one that we just saw. Okay, yeah. And here I also want to mention a bit more about the Huang and Liu's proposal when they used it, when they incorporate the source, self, and prefix. So these are the work of a useful taxonomy introduced by Peter Sells, okay, in classifying the different types of antecedents of logophers. Yeah, and I also use these terms in my average proposal. All right. So what is a self? So a self is the one, okay, who is an intentional agent of communication. Example in 40, Xiaoming says, Xiaomei, Fairy hates self. Okay, so I'm just focusing on the long distance binding relation here. So Xiaoming, someone who said something, that's why we call this a source binding. Source is a type of a logopher. All right, so it's the agent communication. Okay. And then another label is self. For example, Xiaoming, very happy. That's Xiaomei, like self. Okay, again, I focus on a long distance relation here. Okay, so so self is a label being used to refer to the antecedent whose mental state we're trying to categorize. Okay, so we're trying to characterize. So the mental state of being happy. Okay, in a sense, yeah. So self, and then another one, the preferred one. So in preferred, we are saying that it's someone, okay, with respect to whose time, space, location, the content of the proposition is evaluated. So example 42, Li Xu was reading when Zhang Zhang came to visit him. All right, so the self, so this one should be yeah, the co-indexation here. So refer with Zhang Zhang because refer with Li Xu, okay, because we're trying to describe that, okay, trying to talk about it from the user's perspective. But then in private binding, what we can see here is that, okay, it doesn't need to involve any speech verbs, okay, no need to involve, like saying. It doesn't have to involve and it does not involve like mental state as well. Someone's happy, someone is sad, etc. No, it's just used in the sense of from the perspective of somebody. Okay, in that sense, we'll call it private binding. All right, so these three labels are still quite prevalent these days: source binding, self-binding, and preferred binding. I'll talk a bit more as I try to in my LG proposal. Okay, but before I talk about a bit about LFG, okay, it's just another piece of evidence to support that long-distance binding is not quite the same as anaphoric binding in the sense, I mean, in Chinese, because where we see the jitsi can also be free. What I mean by free is that, for example, in 43, as for this idea, besides self, only three people agree. So self referred to, I mean, if we just take a look at the sentence internal entities, there is no antecedent in the sentence because self referred to the speaker. Okay, so and we have noticed is that cross-linguistically, so logophoric binding is so when we look at logophoric reflexives, so this is also a property that is quite widely attested as well. Yeah. So just to add to the concept of logophoricity here, so it's not so I would say that in Chinese, so there are actually two, I would say that cross-linguistically there should be two different, at least, okay, two different types of logophoricity. One that I would call it pure logophoricity, and then another one is what I call like grammatic-sized logophoricity. All right. So what does it actually mean? I would say that in the literature, only until more recently, okay, that there's appears to be some studies addressing the differences between the two. Okay, in the past, okay, usually people didn't really differentiate between those two, but I think that for Chinese, okay, we need to differentiate it. Okay, because it's the type of logophoricity we witness in Chinese is different from some other types of logophoricity that we witness, for example, in some African languages. All right, so to further elaborate what I mean, so first of all, we're to be aware that the concept of logophoricity is actually a pragmatic concept itself. All right, and according to Cooley, 1994, which is also a very influential study, so some the languages which are pure logophoric, they would contain some special forms that can only be used in logophoric domains. Okay, but what we saw with Jitsi is that, okay, so local binding, as what I say, the local binding is different from long distance binding, even though the same form Jitsi is used. Okay, and local binding is not logophoric binding because, for example, it does not subject to blocking effects. Okay, so and from this perspective, the logophoric use of Jitsi in long distance binding is only an extended use of reflexive. All right, so it's not quite the same as languages which show pure logophoricity, like some languages in or calling Kule, okay, those pure logophoric languages are only attested in Africa, okay, because they will all contain just some special forms that are only used in logophoric domains. But we see that Jitsi doesn't have to appear in a logophoric domain. All right, for example, when it appears in a locally bound relation, then this okay, then it's not really logophoric, right? So I would say that Chinese, what I would say is that it exhibits something we call grammatic side logophoricity. So what do I mean by grammatic side logophoricity? So I'm building my argument on a study by Mary Dalrymple on Yadi, okay, and in that proposal, she argues that this language shows what we call as a grammatic size logophoricity. So what does it actually mean? So first of all, we have to be we need to be mindful that if that is a true logopher, what is a true logopher? So for a true logopher, the antecedent, okay, of a true logopher, which is characterize the speech, the thoughts, the feeling. Okay, so in that sense, so the antecedent of a true logopher is identified by pragmatic means, okay, not syntactically. Okay, that's just identify it with some pragmatic strategy because logophoricity itself, okay, is a pragmatic concept, right? Okay, but then if we find that the identification of a logophoric antecedent also has some syntactic requirements, that means the requirements are not purely pragmatic. Then we will conclude that the language displays what we call a grammaticized logophoricity. Okay. So what are the syntactic requirements? So one of the requirements could be a syntactic subject. Okay, syntactic subject requirement, which means, okay, so apart from obeying the discourse condition of logophoricity, okay, the long distance binding itself also has to be subject to, also need to be, the long distance binding itself also has a subject orientation, all right, and that's what Yadi shows, and at the same time, that's what Zizi in Chinese shows as well, okay. And therefore, I would also conclude that the long-distance binding of Zizi exhibits grammaticized logophoricity. All right, yeah. So why am I talking? Yeah. So there's some cross-linguistic data from Icelandic, which has also been argued by Mary Dalrymple as a type of grammaticized logophoric system there. Yeah, and we see that okay, and we see that language also has a subject requirement when it comes to binding, in comparison to oral, okay, where there is where it is a pure logophoric system and there's no subject requirement, etc. Yeah. So why do I talk about this? So the observation, I would say that this kind of observation that Chinese logophoric binding is a grammaticized one has some important implications for how we formalize binding. All right, so we know that since the antecedent can't be defined, okay, in pure pragmatic terms, so when we characterize the logophoric constraints, so we need to at least, okay, some of these constraints have to be stated in a syntactic structure rather than a pragmatic or semantic structure. That's how I would consider that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just an interim summary here. So we take evidence of blocking effects as as evidence that long distance bound GC is a logophile, all right, and we have not observed any blocking effect for local binding. Okay, therefore we assume that local binding of GC is different from this long distance binding. That means, okay, even though GC share the same form in local binding and long distance binding, they are actually different entities, right? So how am I going to characterize this kind of binding? So I would say that a local binding of Ta Jitsi and Jitsi, okay, I would classify them as anaphoric binding, but the long distance binding of Jitsi, I would consider that as a logophoric binding. Okay, so as I talk about logophoric binding, so I will also further subcategorize it using like self, source, or self, this kind of very useful taxonomy, okay, to label that. And we see that in self, source, and self logophoric binding. So usually we will require what we call a logocentric predicate. For example, say verbs, or think, or believe, and know, this kind of verbs, or feel. Okay, but then no logophoric predicate is required for prefix binding. Yeah. So as what I said before, okay, I've noticed that as I was preparing for the talk, okay, I was aware that maybe quite a number of my audience will not have a may not have background in LFG, and also today's focus, I won't be really dealing with a lot of technicalities here. So what I would do with my LFG proposal is that I would just try to illustrate those with the way of reasoning that one may use if we adopt if we adopt an alternative formal framework of LFG to analyze Chinese binding. And also at the same time, I've noticed that in the literature, there's only very, very, very few studies that approach Chinese binding from an LFG perspective. So it's an area that is pretty much that's not that's much less researched on. Yeah. So how do we do binding in LFG? So LFG is very different from if we are familiar with the Chomsky and syntactician the minimalist approach. Okay, so LFG it has what we call a parallel constraint-based architecture. So different types of linguistic information, we use some different formal structures to represent them. All right, and I follow the approach here by the Wimpole 1993 and 2015. Okay, so we will state the binding relations with refer to what we call an F structure rather than a phrase or a syntactic tree. Okay, this is not how my LFG approach would characterize the binding relations. Okay, so just to mention that this F structure usually characterize more called dependency relations. So some grammatical relations like subject, object. Okay, or these are relations that are being captured by the F structure. All right. Yeah, and at the same time, so very different from other approaches. So our binding constraint will be specified lexically. Okay, specified in what we call the lexicon of the reflexives, rather than on a universal basis. So universal basis would be something like, for example, talk about condition A, condition B, condition C. Okay, those are the terms in the government and binding framework, and we try to use, and people try to use those terms to capture very universal type of binding properties across all languages, but that's not how LG handles it. Okay, we state the binding requirements lexically for each of the reflexives or each of the pronouns, and this kind of approach is I would say is better, especially if a language contains a number of different types of pronouns, and each of the pronoun has its own specific binding requirements. Yeah. So at the same time, LFG, okay, so it's a binding relations with these are the semantic in nature. So what do I mean by semantic here? I'm talking about a co-reference. So usually LFG would consider co-referential relationship as a type of semantic relationship. Yeah, even though I'm aware that in some minimalist proposals, so this kind of co-referential relationship can also be captured by feature checking, which is more syntactic than semantic itself. Yeah. And so the binding constraints will always involve some kind of projection from the app structure to the semantic structure. So I'll just give a brief illustration later. So the general form of those in LG, okay, there is still a general form of an avoid binding equation. So it's a really type of think of it as a very it's a type of a mathematical equation here. So what does this equation tells us? All right, so first of all, we include this equation in the lexical entry of a reflexive. All right, so this one refers to the grammatical function of the reflexive. Okay, GF pronoun. All right, and this is the grammatical function of an antecedent. All right, so I will give you a concrete example very soon. Okay, just bear with me of these terms. All right, so what is the binding domain? The binding domain is captured by this part. Okay, this is the binding domain within which the reflexive has to be bound. And we see it as a clean star. So clean star in the sense of the formal language, and in regular language in the sense that it can be from zero to many. Okay, it can be from zero to many grammatical functions. All right. And there is also what we call an off-path constraint. So how does LG do that? Okay, so one example is Thomas put his blanket over himself. Okay? So we include this kind of a binding equation and avoid binding equation in the lexical entry of himself. All right. So we see that. So what does this binding equation tells us is that, okay, so first of all, there is what we call this is the F structure. Okay, of the sentence, Thomas put a blanket over himself, and the reflexive is here. All right, this is a reflexive, and it has to be bound within the domain of object within this domain. Okay, so bigger F structure here, and then it's bound by the subject. All right, so the off-path constraint says, okay, that for this GF, which refers to this one, oblique function GF. So inside the oblique function GF, there shouldn't be any subjects. Okay, so inside the oblique function GF, there is no subject. Okay, so it satisfies this requirement. all right? And okay, so the equation is satisfied, all right? And also by the fact that it's a positive binding equation means that it needs to be bound, okay, within this F structure. Okay, so it needs to be bound by something. So what bounds it is the subject entity Thomas. Okay. And there's a projection mechanism, as what I said in LFG. Okay, we involve is a kind of we capture it as a type of as a type of semantic co-reference relationship. Right. So but then but usually, okay, instead of capturing the entire projection mechanism, so it's quite often to see that in LFG, which sometimes we just use a more informal way, you just index, IJ, this co-referential index, okay, as to capture the binding relation. All right, yeah. And we'll go over this example. This example is very similar. It's an anaphoric binding relation, and it's captured with using a type of equation. It's a mathematical equation with that can reach a mathematical precision. Yeah, to characterize binding. That's how LG does it. So when we apply this to Chinese reflexive, so what can we do? Okay, so first of all, I will just give one example. I won't go into all the details of how it's to be handled because it would be a very, very long long proposal. Okay, so in 他句子, okay, so in the lexical entry, so we included some constraints, the equation, the binding equation that we just saw. Okay, and then we, as what I've talked about, so an equation consists of different parts. Okay, so this part is the grammatical function of the antecedent. Okay, so how do I know what this can be? All right, so when we to deduce it, so I'll give some examples of how to deduce that. As what we just said, okay, so there is a subcommand relation, all right, so which means the GF, okay, first of all, that can be just be can be further embedded. Okay, it can be embedded in a subject. Okay, a possessor in a subject. So that's what this is about. Okay, possessor in a subject. Okay, or it can be a subject inside a subject clause. So how do I know about this? First of all, if we want to use an LFG approach to handle binding, so we need to draw, okay, the F structure, and then look at, then inspect it, say that, what is this one? So it's a subject within a subject. Okay, yeah, so as well again, subject, so subject within a subject, yeah, in a subject clause. Okay, and we use different examples to capture this kind of a relationship. All right, and at the end, okay, we will summarize, okay, the different possibilities in form of the summarize the different possibilities like this. Okay, so the GF and the antecedent of the antecedent to grammatical function can be, so these are the disjunctive option. It can be just be a subject, it can be a possessor embedded in a subject, it can be a subject embedded within a subject clause, or it can be more. Okay, so in LG we do consider that the type binding relation, we want to state it in the sense that it has very high precision. Okay, so we don't really, so that's why we that's how we do it in LFG. Okay, yep. And then I won't be talking about how to derive the off-part constraint because it involves lots of technicalities. So I will just skip this part, but I do want to just give some general, as well as I just want to give some general impression of how LFG does things. Okay, so at the end, okay, after first systematically arrange all the examples and then figure out the mathematical relations, okay, and then we will arrive at a set of binding constraints for the anaphor. Okay, and then for logophor, we use a similar strategy but a different binding equation. This is the equation that Mary-Doreen proposed for logophoric binding. Okay, so and and it involves what we call some of the log feature. That means a feature to use to mark the logophoric domain. Okay, and yeah, and if I apply it to Chinese, for example, let's just quickly take a look at one example. The source binding here. Yeah, so the source binding here, we say that it requires a logophoric predicate like say. Okay, so we say this say marks a logophoric domain. Okay, and when it marks a logophoric domain, so formally we will introduce a log plus feature to the F structure to mark this logophoric domain. All right. That's how the lexical entry of say looks like. Okay, so say, all right, so you can mark the logophoric domain as plus, that means that's logophoric domain, and then it also tells us that the subject of say is a source antecedent. That's how I would do it. Yeah, and then in the long distance binding reflexives, so for GC, so we have the equation for logophoric binding. Okay, so it's saying that all right, so this is the F structure here. Okay, so what we see is say, and then xiaomin, okay, is a source. All right, and then the complement clause so says something, so xiaomei hates him, hates xiaomin hates self. All right, so in that sense, we will see that the binding relation is okay. So this is a logopher. It goes out from and to identify it as the antecedent as the matrix subject. Okay, yeah. So that's how, and it also satisfied a binding equation of logophoric binding. Okay, yeah. So as what you can see here, I mean, in the LFG, okay, if we want to do binding or then it can be done in a way that almost mathematical manner. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in today's talk, okay, I won't go into that as well. So I won't go to all the formal details of my LFG approach to binding. And there is a preceding paper which I think will appear soon, I hope. Yeah. And the paper that if you want to know more about the formal details there, so you can refer to this paper. I look and a constraint-based approach and the following logophoric binding in Mandarin, Chinese, and Cantonese. So my current work at the moment is I'm still working on binding, and I try to compare the different binding relations in different Chinese languages, as well as making some cross-linguistic comparison. And also my recent work, I'm trying to also move to the more into the discourse representational theory and see how in a more formal semantic can help us to enhance the pronominal resolution. Yeah, so this is the end of my talk. Yeah, so and thank you very much for inviting me here today. Again, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was a very, very interesting talk, and you gave a very good, not just the Chinese data, but this whole field. Truly enjoyed it. I was wondering if you're going to make this presentation available somewhere, or I don't know if you mean it public.
So if I mean it to, sorry, just the audio problem.
Oh, sorry. So I try to speak up then. I was just wondering if you're going to make the presentation available somewhere, like on your homepage or.
Yeah, that would be fine. Actually, I've made yeah, I think I try to make this paper available before it officially comes out, and as well, yeah, I can try to make the presentation
Okay.
available. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay, yeah. Any questions or comments? While people are thinking, I was just thinking about two small things.
Yeah, sure.
One is the animacy requirement.
Mm-hmm.
You provided this very interesting explanation that agentivity kind of seems to trigger animacy.
I try to go
Yeah,
back to
that was
this slide.
in the beginning somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you also noted that so most examples from the literature are kind of anthropomorphic, or they have this kind of archaic flavor. So I was just wondering about verbs where you can possibly tell agency and animacy apart. Like, it's things like the system maintains itself by blah blah. Because it's true that the agency is usually about animacy, but if you have an extent of agency, like you may have some transitive verbs which are agentive in extended use of the term, but which do not require animacy. So can you translate something like the system maintains itself using zichi or tatsichi?
It's a bit weird actually if I want to say in Chinese, if I still want to say let me see no I mean it's not quite yeah, well, unless I want to make it sound more like a personification type of style. Yeah.
Awesome.
Otherwise,
Because in
yeah.
English it doesn't have such overtones, or
Yeah.
things like the cabin detached itself from the spaceship. That
Yeah.
that that would sound weird to you in Chinese with zichi.
So yeah. Well, it I mean, or unless you use it in a possessive way, like what example 28 is doing.
Yeah.
With some
Okay.
energy, that'll be fine. But if you try to put it in an object position and then use it sounds like you're making the system alive. That's what native speakers would tell
Oh,
you. It sounds like you're making it alive if you use Jitsi. I guess it's because in Chinese we don't have like itself, we don't have this kind of device and if you want to use itself, you really have to just use Jitsi or Tajitsi, yeah. But at the same time, and we know that if we say that most of the time we are trying to make it sound alive. We are trying to, for example, in the situation of the candle burns itself, okay, and lighten others, or the moon, okay, there's a very literary way of saying that covers itself, but they actually cover herself, that kind of personification style. Yeah. So yeah, I'm aware that Jonathan and Wang, I mean, they might have a different, slight different perspective about that. I mean, because they don't really differentiate, don't really point out that it's the literary style there. But I think early studies like 10, they pointed it out. That is about the stylistic differences. And in order to capture this kind of difference better, I would say that perhaps corpus study, yeah, it is a better strategy than doing grammatical survey like what Shanafo and Juan did, because in grammaticality survey, I mean you can't really tell, and people won't give you comments, further comments, just judge that this is a good sentence. For example, like the moon cover herself, it sounds a very, very well polished type of sentence, and of course it's grammatical, right? But if we do a
yeah.
more proper study, then we can see the genres, or where do these sentences occur, and then it'd be a better way of categorizing it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it does seem to be a real difference between English and Chinese anyway, because I
Yeah.
think, if you tested people on, let's say, the cabin detached itself, English native speakers wouldn't have problems with that, but then there's something about Chinese, obviously. So
Yeah.
yeah. And then other thing that I wanted to ask you about is this very interesting blocking effect, which you have with the third person deictic use, with the deictic use of the third person pronoun he, and you
Uh,
don't have that blocking effect with lexical noun phrases.
yes, the personal
So
asymmetry. Is that this one?
like in a framework like LFG, there would probably be no difference between a lexical noun phrase and the third person singular pronoun. They would just be third person
Mm-hmm.
singular likewise. But
Mm-hmm.
if I think about Hungarian, for example, where we have agreement all over the place,
Mm-hmm.
you get several constructions where third person pronouns show agreement, and lexical singular lexical noun phrases don't.
Mm.
So you see the point? Like, would there be any reason to assume that somehow a name is not, or doesn't have agreement features in Chinese, or would that be like a,
So
yeah,
I
if you
would
see
say,
my point?
yeah, I can see your point. And it's also, it just reminds me of something that, some Chinese linguists are always saying is like, but it's also true that, in Chinese is, we have less morphology.
Yeah, that's true.
Like basically we don't really have agreement morphology. And as you can see in all these sentences that we don't have agreement morphology to tell like a third person agreement or noun or full noun phrase agreement or agreement with pronouns yeah, so in the sense that I believe it's very different from Hungarian, because as well as said, Hungarian is very rich in their morphological system, and uh, and and in that sense, so it won't be, yeah, it's not really about blocking, like it's just about, whether it is a correct or a wrong agreement, yeah. Yeah, but in Chinese, it's more, yeah, in Chinese, when this kind of morphological agreement system is not there, then yeah, and what we see blocking is, if we subscribe to a more logophoric explanation, is that there's some discourse conditions happening, something about discourse, like the perspective conflicts, or all these are actually discourse terms happening. And yeah, so that is how that I think would, I mean, empirically, I would think that it has a better empirical power in explaining blocking effects than some approaches like the feature agreement approaches. Yeah, and yeah.
Yeah, that was just, like a thought experiment that in a feature-based system, you could say that the
Mm,
name just doesn't have person features,
mm,
but the pronoun would. So,
mm.
but
But
anyway, yeah, you
yeah,
would need
but I
evidence.
mean, even if, yeah, but how do we explain, like, okay, so how do we explain a personal asymmetry without say like a different first person, second person, third person
Yeah,
asymmetry?
that's
Yeah.
then you need some kind of a hierarchy. So
Mm,
obviously it doesn't explain
mm,
that. Yeah. So
mm.
I also agree that the logophoric account is the better one.
Yeah, because sometimes even if the most complicated data, like this one that I'm
Yeah.
showing, there's nothing about, all of them are third person.
Yeah.
Right, so noun phrase, full noun phrases, third person, and then and that kind of blocking still occurs. So it makes it less likely that it will be, yeah, that is likely that it's about some abstract agreement, if that is what you are suggesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much once again. That was a very interesting talk, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it gave us a very good overview. So I can only
Yeah.
recommend your uh, articles on this topic to everybody who has listened to this talk, or to everybody else. And well, thank you very much for doing this talk
Yeah.
once again.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, thank you, Peter, as well. Thank you, both of you. Really,
Yeah.
really
Thank you very
grateful to
much.
be here with you today.